Ethan Stone had always known the land would shape his fate, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the day the wind changed and the world he knew began to unravel. Willow Creek Valley was a vast, unforgiving expanse, a tapestry woven from endless skies, rugged peaks, and the whispering grasslands that stretched to the horizon. It was a place for tough men, men who carved their existence from rock and resilience, and Ethan was undeniably one of them. For 5 long years, since the silence of loss had settled upon his cabin like a shroud, he'd lived alone, a widower who sought solace in the stark, unyielding solitude of his isolated home. It sat 3 miles from Harmony Bluff, a collection of dusty buildings that barely qualified as a town. Its distant hum was a faint echo Ethan rarely sought, preferring the profound quiet of his own making. He was a man of few words, his conversations reserved for the rustle of dry leaves, the groan of ancient timber under the weight of winter, and the honest, cutting wind that swept through the valley, carrying with it the scents of pine and distant rain. His days unfolded in a predictable rhythm of self-sufficiency, a ritual forged from necessity and ingrained habit. He chopped wood until his muscles ached with satisfying fatigue, split logs with powerful, precise swings, and hauled water from the frozen creek. He mended fences under the unforgiving sun, his hands calloused and strong, and hunted with the quiet efficiency of a predator, filling his larder with game that ensured his survival through the lean months. It was a life he'd chosen, or perhaps a life that had claimed him after grief had stripped away all other desires. He found a grim comfort in the predictable harshness of the wilderness, a mirror to the barren landscape of his own soul. The wild offered no false promises, no fleeting comforts, only the brutal truth of existence. Yet, even the most predictable rhythms could be broken, shattered by the unexpected. One frigid evening, after a blizzard had raged for 3 days, burying the valley in a pristine, deadly silence, Ethan discovered a peculiar stain on his cabin floor, a dark, rusty smear, tracing a distinct path from the back door where the snow had piled high, leading deeper into the room towards the warmth of the hearth. It was blood, fresh and potent, the kind that spoke of raw pain, stark against the rough-hewn planks. A wounded coyote, he figured, must have limped in seeking refuge from the storm's fury, bleeding out its silent agony before vanishing back into the vast white world. The thought was fleeting, a brief ripple in the quiet pool of his existence. He cleaned it up with practiced efficiency, the metallic scent of copper lingering in the air, a stark, unwelcome reminder of life's brutal fragility. The next morning, the sun broke through the leaden clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in blinding white and brilliant gold. It was a deceptive beauty, masking the raw chill that still clung stubbornly to the air, promising more ice than warmth. Ethan was splitting kindling by the porch, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing in the crisp, brittle silence. When she appeared, she emerged from the thick line of frosted pines at the edge of his clearing, a figure so small, so indistinct against the vastness of the snow-laden wilderness. He almost missed her. She moved with a quiet urgency, her steps light on the snow, as if she barely dared to disturb the frozen ground beneath her worn boots. She was just a wisp of a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, her face a canvas of quiet endurance, etched with lines that spoke of trials beyond her years. Her clothes, a patchwork of worn fabric, hung loosely on her slender frame, patched more times than they were whole. Her boots, scuffed and weary, looked ready to surrender with every step she took. In her eyes, a deep-seated exhaustion lingered, yet her spine remained unbending, a rod of silent defiance against unseen burdens. She didn't speak when he offered her a broom, merely gave a slight nod, She didn't speak when she hauled buckets of icy water from the well, the cold seeping through the thin wood, not even when she scraped the last remnants of blood from his floorboards. A task that seemed to absorb her entire, silent being, as if it were the most natural and necessary thing in the world. The first time Ethan hired her, a practical, cynical thought flickered through his mind. Born from years of watching people come and go, she wouldn't last the day. But Clara May defied his quiet expectations. She worked like silence itself, thorough, invisible, leaving no trace of her presence beyond the pristine cleanliness she brought to his disordered cabin. She never asked for more than the meager coins he offered, never haggled, never questioned the fairness of the exchange. She simply nodded. A brief, almost imperceptible gesture, wiped her hands on her worn apron, and then, without so much as a goodbye, melted back towards the rolling hills as dusk began to bleed its muted purples and grays into the sky. There was no wagon waiting for her at the edge of his property, no horse tethered at the bend in the trail, no man to greet her with a comforting word or outstretched hand. She simply vanished into the deepening shadows of the trees, becoming one with the fading light, leaving Ethan with nothing but the lingering scent of damp earth, the clean smell of lye soap, and a growing sense of unanswered questions that tugged at the edges of his solitude. He didn't dwell on it then. Not really. His life was too focused on the tangible, the immediate, the predictable. Yet, 3 weeks later, she came again. Same hour, same profound silence that preceded her work, same tireless, methodical effort. She left the silver coin untouched on his table when he wasn't looking, a quiet refusal that spoke volumes of a pride he couldn't yet fathom. He began to watch her. The third time she came, then the fourth. Something about her movements began to strike a deeper chord within him, a resonance that defied his usual stoicism. It wasn't the confident gait of someone accustomed to hard labor, but rather the measured steps of someone who had no other choice, a person perpetually bracing for the next unseen blow life might deliver. Even in her silence, there was a story etched into her every line, every deliberate motion, a narrative he instinctively yearned to unravel. By her fifth visit, he knew her name. It didn't come from her lips. He had never heard her utter a single word, not even a whisper. Instead, he found it scrawled on a small worn cloth satchel she accidentally left by the door one afternoon. Clara May. The handwriting was neat, almost delicate, the letters soft against the rough fabric. There was no surname, no family name stitched into the worn material, just Clara May. The sixth time she came and vanished in the deepening dusk. Ethan followed her. It wasn't a conscious, premeditated decision. He hadn't truly meant to. But dusk fell quickly that day, painting the sky in fiery hues, and he found himself standing on the porch, watching her disappear again into the thick, dark line of trees at the edge of his clearing. There was no clear trail he could discern, no well-worn road a wagon might take, just dense brush, tangled roots, and the endless, rolling hills that seemed to swallow her whole. He saddled his horse, telling himself he was merely checking the north fence. A flimsy excuse he knew even then wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. He rode slowly, deliberately, the deepening shadows of the forest folding around him. He half expected her to look back, to offer some sign of acknowledgement, some fleeting glance that might explain her silence. But she never did. She never looked back. The trail she took was sharp and narrow, barely wide enough for a man on foot, a winding path only known to those who truly belonged to the wild. He dismounted halfway, leading his horse, the encroaching darkness swallowing the familiar landscape around him, making the trees loom like silent sentinels. His curiosity, A tenacious seed planted deep in his solitary existence had finally taken root, and now it pulled him forward, away from the quiet predictability of his life, into the vast, whispering unknown. He felt an undeniable pull, a need to understand. The trail Clara May took wounded, sharp, and narrow, barely wide enough for a man on foot, let alone a horse. Ethan dismounted halfway, the growing darkness of the Willow Creek Valley swallowing the familiar landscape around him, making the towering pines loom like silent sentinels. His breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a cloud of white in the deepening twilight. The silence here was different from the one in his cabin. It was a heavy, watchful quiet, the kind that preceded discovery, filled with the rustling whispers of the wild itself. He pushed through dense brush, his eyes scanning for any sign, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. The path twisted, ascending a final, rocky ridge that rose sharply against the darkening sky, its jagged silhouette a grim outline against the fading light. And then he saw it. It wasn't a home, not in any true sense of the word, not even a proper shack, merely a desperate shelter. It was a hovel, barely more than a lean-to, tucked precariously beneath the skeletal, decaying remains of an old miner's shed. The roof, patched haphazardly with faded tops that flapped softly in the chill breeze, sagged under the weight of recent snow, threatening to collapse at any moment. Smoke snaked from a crooked chimney, a thin, dying breath against the vast, cold expanse of the sky, struggling to escape its confines. This was where she vanished to each day. This was her refuge, her hidden world. The realization hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow, a raw, unexpected ache in his chest, far more profound than the cold biting at his exposed skin. He moved closer, his steps careful, silent, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace, if one could call it that. Through a tear in the makeshift curtains, barely visible in the dim light, he saw her silhouette flickering against the meager glow of a low-burning fire. Clara May. She was stirring something in a dented, blackened pot, her movements slow, deliberate. The quiet exhaustion he'd observed amplified by the stark, brutal reality of her surroundings. The air hung heavy with the scent of wood smoke and a faint, desperate hope. Then a sound, the small, sharp cry of a child tripping, followed by an immediate, chilling silence, a reflex born of hard-learned lessons. Clara May rushed out, barefoot despite the frozen dirt, sweeping the tiny figure into her arms with a swift, maternal instinct. Ethan heard the soft murmur of her voice, words he couldn't discern, but the tone was unmistakable, a mother's tender comfort, a whispered reassurance in a world of hardship. She kissed the boy's forehead, a simple gesture of profound love that transcended their squalor, and carried him back inside, away from the biting cold. Around her, life bloomed with a fierce, untamed resilience, like tough weeds pushing through the cracks of ruin. Children, 5 of them. The oldest, a boy, couldn't have been more than 10, his frame wiry and alert, his eyes carrying the weight of premature understanding. The youngest, still a toddler, was toddling in bare feet through the frozen dirt, oblivious to the biting cold, chasing an unseen butterfly of imagination. They moved with an almost unsettling efficiency, like clockwork figures in a silent, desperate dance for survival. They gathered meager firewood from the scattered brush, fetched water from a near-frozen stream that whispered its reluctance, and mended torn blankets with small, nimble fingers, their movements practiced and precise. Not a single complaint, not a single cry of hunger escaped their lips. Just motion, just survival. Ethan stood there, frozen by the raw, unvarnished truth of their existence. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched, the weight of their quiet resilience pressing down on him. The sheer, unyielding will to endure in such desolate conditions shattered something deep within him, changing everything he thought he knew about quiet people and the hidden burdens they carried. He left without saying a word. The image of their silent struggle burned into his memory, a seed of responsibility taking root in his barren heart. The next morning, Ethan found himself driven by a quiet urgency he hadn't felt in years, a compulsion that dwarfed his usual solitude. He didn't wait for dawn to fully break, nor did he hesitate to break his routine. He rode to Harmony Bluff, navigating the still frozen trails, returning with a sack of flour, enough to last a small family for weeks, along with dried beans and salt pork. He found Clara May's hovel just as the sun began to warm the valley, coaxing a fragile promise of spring from the reluctant earth. With deliberate care, he nailed the sack of flour to her doorframe, high enough to be seen, ensuring it wouldn't be missed, couldn't be easily ignored. He left without waiting for thanks. The act its own reward, a subtle defiance of his own ingrained isolation and the expectations of the world. He simply needed to do it. A week later, the sack was gone. He felt a flicker of something akin to relief, a silent acknowledgement across the vast, unspoken distance between them. A fragile bridge built on quiet gestures. The week after that, she showed up again at his cabin, appearing as quietly as a shadow, her presence a soft shift in the air. She said nothing, as always, but cleaned everything with her usual thoroughness, her hands moving with practiced grace. When she finished, she left the coin untouched on his table, a gesture of independent pride that Ethan understood, even admired. But this time, before vanishing back into the trees, she paused at the door, just for a moment. She looked back, her eyes meeting his across the vast expanse of his cabin. A fleeting, almost imperceptible shift in her guarded expression. A silent question, perhaps, or a hint of recognition. Then, she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering sense of a connection forming. By the end of that month, Ethan had stopped pretending he wasn't watching the winding, unseen trail she took back and forth, a thin line across the wilderness connecting their two disparate worlds. He began leaving extra provisions on the table, freshly baked biscuits wrapped in clean cloth, a jar of golden, sun-drenched honey from his own hives, dried meat cured from his last hunt, small offerings placed with quiet intent, always in the same spot. She never took more than one thing at a time, a gesture of independent pride that Ethan understood, even admired, for it echoed his own self-reliance. Once, she left a note, small and folded, tucked beneath a fresh loaf of bread he'd left. "Please stop." That was all. Not angry. Just quiet. Final. So he stopped. Or tried to. The invisible line she drew around herself was clear. A boundary he respected, even as a growing ache of concern settled in his chest. A deep-seated worry for their fragile existence. But then, one cold, crisp day, a boy came. He was maybe 10 years old, his small frame wiry and soot-streaked from the hovel's smoke. His voice surprisingly deep for someone so small, carrying a quiet gravity. He knocked on Ethan's door, the rhythm practiced, rehearsed, as if he'd been preparing for this moment for days. Ethan opened it to find the boy clutching a woven basket of fresh eggs, still warm from the nest, and a small, folded note, its edges softened by tiny fingers. "For the help," the boy, Noah said, his eyes wide and earnest, his gaze unwavering. "That's all we can give. Thank you." He turned and left before Ethan could speak, his small figure disappearing back into the winding trail. leaving Ethan holding the basket, a tangible connection to the family he'd only observed from a distance, a fragile gift of gratitude. That night, it snowed hard, the kind of snow that crushed roofs under its immense, suffocating weight, that smothered the land in a deadly embrace, that killed cattle trapped in open pastures by its relentless chill. Ethan sat up late by the fire, its warmth doing little to thaw the sudden chill of anxiety that gripped him. His gaze kept drifting to the closed door, the image of the small boy's earnest face etched in his mind, his quiet "thank you" echoing in the cabin. Clara May didn't come the next morning, nor the next. On the third day, the oppressive quiet of his cabin felt too heavy, too cold, a silence that screamed of danger. Ethan couldn't sit still any longer. Before dawn broke, painting the sky in pale, hopeful hues of rose and lavender, he saddled his horse and rode. He didn't wait on the ridge this time. He rode until the trail narrowed again, until the faint outline of her hovel, barely visible beneath a fresh blanket of snow, came into view. A sharp, visceral dread twisted in his gut. The roof had collapsed, not entirely, but a significant corner had caved in, a gaping maw against the morning sky, exposing the fragile interior to the elements. Smoke no longer curled from the crooked chimney. No sign of life breathed from within. He dismounted, approaching with the speed born of raw fear, his boots crunching in the thick snow. Inside, huddled beneath thick, patched quilts, were the children, their small forms huddled together for warmth, their eyes wide and watchful, like small, hunted animals caught in the open. But Clara May was not among them. "Clara May," Ethan called softly, his voice rough with unspoken fear, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. No answer. He stepped inside, the lingering heat from embers buried deep in ash still clinging to the air, a ghostly warmth in the freezing cold. One of the younger girls, no older than 5, blinked up at him, wide-eyed, clutching a doll missing an arm, its button eye staring blankly. "Mama went for help," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Fragile as ice. Yesterday, Noah, older now, protective, stood beside her, his small fists clenched, his jaw set. She said she'd come back, by night, but she hadn't." Ethan didn't wait. He didn't question, didn't deliberate. The silence in the hovel, the children's watchful eyes, fueled his urgency. He turned and rode, heading towards the main trail, searching every winding path she could have taken, every ravine, every shadowed grove, his horse's hooves pounding a desperate rhythm against the frozen ground. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and violent red, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. It was near dusk when he finally found her, curled beneath a fallen pine, snow dusting her still form like a shroud. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle beneath her, and her arm, bent wrong, protruded from a thin sleeve. A stark image of brokenness. She was conscious, barely. Her lips were cracked and dry, a faint smear of blood on her sleeve. "I was coming back," she murmured, her voice a fragile rasp against the vast silence, a testament to her enduring spirit. Ethan didn't speak. He simply dismounted, his movements quick and decisive, gently lifted her fragile form, and carefully carried her to his horse. A silent promise hanging in the frigid air. When he brought Clara May into his cabin, the children, who had been waiting in quiet terror, gasped, tiny sounds of shock and relief escaping their lips. He had brought them all, loaded into a heavy cart he'd hitched to his horse, bundled in quilts, their small figures silent and stiff with fear. Now. They sat huddled by the roaring fire, their wide eyes fixed on Clara May, who lay pale and still on Ethan's bed, her breathing shallow and ragged. It was the first time Ethan Stone had let anyone else inside his home, inside the sanctuary he had built around his grief. Since his wife died 5 long years ago, the walls that had protected his solitude now welcomed a cacophony of quiet lives. He knew, with the certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it wouldn't be the last. The snow didn't let up for 3 more days, a relentless white curtain across the valley. But inside the cabin, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight, a new kind of warmth began to stir. A quiet hum of life he hadn't known he missed. The snow didn't let up for 3 more days, a relentless white curtain across the Willow Creek Valley. But inside Ethan's cabin, bathed in the soft glow of the firelight, a new kind of warmth began to stir. A quiet hum of life he hadn't known he missed. Each morning, Ethan rose early, the chill still biting at the edges of the air, and stoked the fire before the cabin lost what little heat it had held through the long night. He made oats when there were oats, boiling water to soften the grains, and when the supply ran low, he found creative ways to stretch what little they had. He tried not to look too long at Clara May sleeping in his bed, her brow glistening with fever, her arm splintered with a piece of kindling he'd found and expertly bound in place with one of his old worn shirts. Her breathing was shallow, ragged, and sometimes a soft groan would escape her lips, quickly stifled. He watched her, a silent vigil. The raw vulnerability of her form a stark contrast to the quiet strength she usually projected. The children, silent and solemn, moved like shadows with names around him. They never asked questions, their wide, watchful eyes taking in everything but revealing little. Noah, the oldest, was just 11, but already half a man in the way he spoke and carried himself. A quiet protector. He rarely left Clara May's side for long, unless it was to fetch more wood from the dwindling pile outside, or to soothe the younger ones when their small whimpers threatened to break the fragile peace. Grace was next, 9 years old, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hands that knew how to thread a needle better than most grown women Ethan had met. She was the one who quietly organized the quilts at night, who carefully portioned the bread into even strips so that everyone received their fair share, and who instinctively kept Luke, Owen, and Daisy close whenever the door creaked open, as if bracing against an unseen threat. Luke, 7, already missing 2 front teeth, still kept a slingshot tucked into his waistband. A miniature soldier prepared for a battle he didn't yet understand. Owen was barely 5, skittish and soft-voiced, prone to hiding behind chairs when unfamiliar sounds stirred the air. And Daisy, the baby, was just 3, still sleeping with one thumb in her mouth and the other wrapped tightly around the hem of Grace's skirt. A tiny anchor to her sister's presence. They took up space Ethan hadn't realized his home had. His floorboards creaked more under the constant movement. The fireplace burned faster, demanding more wood than he had ever used alone. The room felt smaller, certainly, but also warmer, more alive, infused with the quiet breath of multiple lives. A stark contrast to the hollow silence that had settled after his wife's passing. But it wasn't the noise or the constant movement that truly unnerved him. It was the quiet gratitude, the way they thanked him without words. A subtle tilt of the head, a lingering gaze, the way Noah nodded with a solemn dignity when Ethan handed him a plate of hot oats, the way Grace, with her nimble fingers, folded his shirts after drying them by the fire, leaving them neat and warm. the way tiny Daisy, with her trusting eyes, offered him her ragged doll, a priceless treasure, as a silent trade for a warm mug of tea. These were children used to paying for kindness, their small souls hardened by a world that demanded a price for every comfort. Ethan didn't ask about the man who'd fathered them. He didn't need to. He saw the answers etched in Clara May's face when she stirred, half conscious, her eyes darting to count the children, a frantic, primal instinct, before she even registered where she was. He saw it in the way the kids flinched at the unexpected sound of boots on wood, a quick, almost imperceptible tremor that spoke volumes of past trauma. He saw it in the fading bruises on Clara May's ribs, dark constellations of violence slowly dimming beneath her skin. By the fourth day, Clara May finally managed to sit up on her own, a monumental effort that left her trembling. Her lips were dry, cracked like the parched earth outside, but her voice, when it came, was clear and even, albeit raspy from disuse. "I told you not to follow me," she said, her gaze steady, direct, surprisingly devoid of accusation. Ethan, kneeling to check her bandage, didn't look up. "You told me a lot of things," he'd replied, his voice low, without saying a word. She winced as he gently adjusted her splint. "You should have left us there." "I did," he said quietly, a single, definitive word hanging in the air. She didn't reply, just closed her eyes and leaned back, her breath catching for a moment as a stitch of pain tightened in her side. The fire cracked between them, its cheerful sound filling the vast space where too many things wanted to be said. Too many questions lingered unspoken. Later that night, Ethan found Noah sitting on the porch steps, wrapped tightly in one of Ethan's oversized coats, a small, solitary figure, watching the moon drag its silver light across the silent trees. Ethan joined him without speaking, settling onto the top step beside the boy. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind born of shared burdens and unspoken understanding, before the boy finally spoke, his young voice surprisingly steady. "She doesn't sleep much," Noah said, his gaze fixed on the distant shadows. Ethan nodded, understanding. "She gets up when she thinks we're all asleep, checks our shoes, our coats, makes sure we've got enough food packed in the sacks." His voice, though quiet, held a deep, painful wisdom beyond his years. "She always thinks she's going to have to run again." Ethan turned to look at him, surprised by the calm, almost matter-of-fact tone. "You ever ask her why?" Noah shook his head slowly, a grim acceptance in his eyes. "Didn't have to." They didn't speak again after that. Not that night, but something shifted between them. The boy stood a little taller the next day, his silent acknowledgement a heavier weight than any spoken thanks. Ethan stopped waiting for thanks, knowing it was not what mattered. That week, a quiet purpose settled over Ethan. He repaired the broken sled behind the cabin, its wooden runners splintered and cracked, and hitched it to his old mule. He hauled back 2 heavy sacks of flour and a half-cured ham from Harmony Bluff, telling the shopkeeper he'd taken in a distant cousin, a flimsy cover story he hoped would satisfy the man's curiosity. He left before the shopkeeper could ask anything else, his focus solely on the fragile lives waiting back at the cabin. When he came back, Clara May was sitting near the fire, her hair still damp from a rare, precious wash, holding tiny Daisy in her lap. "You're not obligated," she said simply, her gaze steady, meeting his as he set the supplies down. Her voice a quiet challenge. "Neither are you," he replied, his own voice low, firm. And that, somehow, settled it. It wasn't a grand decision. There were no dramatic declarations, no promises exchanged under flickering candlelight. It was just a quiet, unspoken series of choices made in the harsh reality of their shared existence. Clara May stopped leaving after supper, the last rays of sunlight no longer signaling her solitary departure. The children, sensing a shift, began to unpack their few meager belongings into the corner shelves Ethan had hastily put up. Luke asked, with a shy, hopeful smile, if he could sleep in the small loft above the main room. Grace, ever the organizer, started keeping a precise tally of their meals, managing their dwindling provisions with careful foresight. Noah, ever vigilant, offered to help Ethan fix the old chicken coop, its rickety walls a constant invitation for predators. Clara May began mending the seams of Ethan's worn shirts without comment, her nimble fingers working magic on torn fabric. And Ethan, without fully realizing it, started looking forward to the sound of small footsteps in the morning, the quiet hum of activity that filled the cabin with something akin to life. But peace never holds in places like Harmony Bluff. Not for long. Not for those who carry the scent of defiance and freedom. It was nearly 2 weeks before anyone came asking. The first was a woman, older, her face pinched, her hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt. She rode up to the cabin midday, dust clinging to her boots and disapproval etched into her eyes. She barely glanced at Ethan before demanding, her voice sharp and brittle, "You seen Clara May?" Ethan stood on the porch, arms crossed, his stance solid. "Who's asking?" he replied, his voice calm, even. "Her husband's cousin," the woman lied, her eyes darting past him, trying to peer into the cabin. Ethan didn't flinch. "That's so. She's taken something. Ran off with the children. The man's beside himself, looking." Ethan said nothing, just let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, until the woman's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion igniting within them. "You hiding her?" she asked flatly, her voice dropping, a dangerous edge creeping in. "Lady," he said, his voice low, a warning in every syllable. "If I was, I wouldn't tell you." She left in a huff, her horse kicking up dust, but Ethan watched her until she disappeared down the winding trail. He then rode out himself the next morning, taking the long route through the hills, checking for fresh tracks, listening for distant hooves, a cold knot forming in his gut. He told Clara May that night what had happened. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply pulled her children closer, whispering something to them in a language Ethan didn't know. A soft, hushed stream of words that brought a strange comfort to their small faces. The next day, he built a hidden latch on the trapdoor in the pantry, reinforcing the root cellar beneath with heavy stones, just in case. For a time after that, things settled again. Spring tried its best to shake off the last of the frost, coaxing reluctant green shoots from the thawing earth. Clara May began moving easier. Her arm still ached. Ethan knew, but she used it without complaint, her movements regaining a familiar strength. She even planted small roots in the back garden, tiny sprouts of hope pushing through the dark soil. The children laughed more now, their voices brighter, filling the valley with a joy that had been absent for too long. Daisy started calling Ethan Papa by accident, her small voice echoing the warmth in the cabin. The first time she said it. Clara May froze, like she'd been slapped, a flicker of fear in her eyes. But Ethan just smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes and gently touched the girl's soft hair. Still, beneath the warmth, Ethan felt it that pull of something unfinished, like breath held too long, a storm circling just beyond sight. He'd seen it before, knew its scent. It came on a Tuesday. Ethan was out with Noah and Luke, repairing the west fence, its old timber weakened by winter's grip, when they saw the rider. Dark coat, black horse, straight-backed and moving with a slow, deliberate cadence, like a man who didn't expect trouble but knew exactly what to do if it came. Ethan told the boys to stay back, his voice low and firm. A silent command they instinctively obeyed. He stepped out onto the trail, shotgun slung across his back, just as the man pulled up his reins, his dark eyes sweeping over Ethan with an unnerving calm. "You stone?" the rider asked, his voice low and even, a dangerous ripple beneath the surface. "I am. I'm looking for Clara May." "What for?" Ethan's voice was steady, betraying none of the apprehension that was tightening in his gut. "She's mine," the man said, calm as still water, his words dripping with a chilling possessiveness. "Took my kids, took my name, thinks she can disappear." Ethan felt something cold twist low in his chest, a knot of icy dread. "She's not yours," he said, his own voice hardening, defiance rising to meet the man's arrogance. The man dismounted slowly, unhurried, radiating a chilling confidence. "She will be." And then, without warning, the man smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his mouth that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "She was always good at making men think they were saving her," he said, his eyes glinting with a dark amusement. "You'll see." Ethan didn't reply, didn't move. But that night, he slept with his boots on, kept a lantern burning low in the cabin, its flickering light a lonely sentinel against the encroaching darkness. And when he heard Clara May's soft footsteps in the hall, saw her silhouette pause near the doorway, he knew. She'd heard every word. The wind shifted the next morning, the air feeling different, charged with an unspoken tension. Ethan Stone, once a man who swore he had never opened his door to another soul, now found himself checking the windows, counting firewood, measuring the distance between the cabin and the tree line, his senses on high alert. Something was coming. He just didn't know when or how. The air had shifted the morning Silas Vance first appeared, carrying a new, ominous scent that Ethan Stone knew well. It was the scent of trouble, of a predator marking its territory. Silas hadn't come alone. 2 men rode beside him, silent as shadows. One was tall and grim-looking, while the other was young and jittery. Silas himself was unnerving in his calm, moving with the unsettling confidence of ownership. He pulled his horse to a stop 50 yards from Ethan's cabin, his eyes sweeping over the quiet home with an arrogant possessiveness. "You stone," Silas had called out, his voice smooth as river ice. I'm looking for Clara May." "What for?" "She's mine," Silas had stated, his words dripping with chilling certainty. "Took my kids, took my name. Think she can disappear?" His dark, unblinking eyes fixed on Ethan, daring him to argue. Ethan felt something cold twist low in his chest. "She's not yours," he'd countered, his own voice hardening. Silas dismounted slowly, unhurried. "She will be." Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he'd sneered. "She was always good at making men think they were saving her. You'll see." Ethan hadn't replied, but the words had sunk deep, a poison in the fragile peace they had built. After that first encounter, Ethan and Clara May knew Silas wouldn't give up. The subtle shifts in the wind, The uneasy silence of the forest, all whispered of his lingering presence. They stopped pretending. Ethan slept with his boots on, a lantern burning low in the cabin, its flickering light a lonely sentinel. He'd seen Clara May's silhouette pause near the doorway, listening, and he knew she'd heard every word. The air felt charged with unspoken tension. Ethan, once a man who swore he'd never open his door to another soul, now found himself checking windows, counting firewood, his senses on high alert. Something was coming. The threat escalated quickly. The next morning, they found the chicken coop door left wide open, its hinges dangling like snapped bones. Every last hen, every last egg was gone. No prints, no blood, just feathers scattered like snow in the dirt. Ethan didn't have to guess. Silas had returned with a patient, insidious cruelty, meant to bleed them slowly. Clara May didn't say a word, just picked up a handful of crushed feathers and let them fall, one by one, into the wind. Grace stood behind her, fists clenched. Noah scanned the tree line, jaw set. Luke kicked at a loose plank, and Daisy, too young to understand, began to cry. Later that afternoon, Ethan rode into Harmony Bluff for supplies, a necessary risk. Clara May stayed behind to mend the coop fence with Noah. The town had changed. People stared longer, whispered more, whispers of theft, betrayal, all laced with small-town judgment. Ethan bought flour, salt, dried beans, and replaced the axe Silas had split down the handle and left embedded in the porch post a jagged symbol. More than a mere threat. He rode back slower than usual. Something in his gut coiled wrong. The moment he stepped into the clearing, he saw it. The shed behind the barn was burning. Just black beams and scorched earth. Clara May was already throwing water, bucket by bucket. The fire was mostly out, but smoke curled thick in the air. "Where are the kids?" Ethan asked, leaping off his horse. "In the cellar," Clara May said, breathless. "Noah took them when he saw the smoke. Anyone see who did it?" "No," she replied. Inside the cabin, nailed to the wall above Ethan's bed, was a strip of Clara May's old apron, torn, singed, and tied in a perfect bow. Below it, carved deep into the wood, were 3 chilling words: "She is mine." Ethan didn't speak. He stared at it for a long time before turning and walking out. Clara May followed him. "Do we leave?" she asked. "No," he said, his voice grim. "We make it clear we're not afraid." But fear wasn't the problem anymore. Anger was, the kind that didn't scream but waited, coiled and ready. Ethan wasn't a violent man, not anymore, but he'd fought for things before. This time, it was different. This time, it was people. This time, he wasn't willing to lose. So he started planning. He fortified the cabin, not like a fortress, but like a haven that could withstand. He moved the children's sleeping pallets closer to the hearth, where walls were thickest. He kept his rifle near. Noah stayed close to the window. Grace tied bells to the back door. Luke carried a kitchen knife in his belt. Clara May didn't object. She taught them how to be careful, not scared. 3 days passed, then 4. No sign of Silas, until the letter came. Ethan found it nailed to a tree stump near the edge of the property. Folded parchment sealed in red wax. Inside, just 4 lines. "You made your choice. She made hers. The law is on my side. I'll come when I please." No signature, just a pressed thump, crimson and stark. Ethan brought the letter to Clara May. She read it, her hands not shaken. "He's bluffing," she said. "He won't come with lawmen. He won't risk their questions. He won't need them," Ethan countered. "He'll come with men who wear law on their lips and vengeance in their boots." Clara May folded the letter and, without a word, set it in the fire. That night, Ethan stood watch alone. The air was too still. Scout paced restlessly. Clara May didn't sleep, staying near the children. Around midnight, the wind picked up, Scout growled, and Ethan stepped onto the porch just in time to see lanterns bobbing in the darkness. 3 of them. He didn't wait. He lit the signal torch near the barn. 3 bursts of flame for Noah's eyes, a warning they'd practiced. The plan was for them to vanish into the hidden root cellar. But Ethan didn't move. He stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, and waited. The first man stepped into the clearing, then the second, and then Silas, his mouth curving into that slow, poisonous smile. "You really think you're going to stop me?" he called out. Ethan didn't answer. "You're a fool." "Stone," Silas sneered. "She's not worth dying for." That was when Clara May stepped out, not from the cellar, but from the shadows behind the barn. She held the old hunting rifle. Her stance was perfect, her eyes steady. "Then come and find out," she said, her voice clear and strong. Silas froze. "Clara May," he warned. "Don't you dare. You threatened my children," she said. "You burned what little we had. You think I'll let you near them again?" Silas took a step forward. She fired. Not to hit, but close enough. The shot ripped through the tool shed. The younger man dropped his gun and bolted. The grim-looking man hesitated, then cursed and followed. Silas stood alone. "You wouldn't," he spat. "I just did." Ethan stepped beside her, his hand finding hers. "Then you've got nothing left here," he said. "You think she'll stay with you?" Silas snarled. "You think this is home?" Clara May's voice was cold. "It's more home than you ever gave me." And then she lowered the rifle, not in surrender, but in choice. "Go," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but absolute. "Before I change my mind." Silas stared at her, rage warring with disbelief. But something in her face, something final and unbreakable, broke him. He turned and walked away, his figure swallowed whole by the silent forest. Ethan didn't speak until the last lantern light disappeared. Then he turned to Clara May. "You weren't supposed to come out," he said. "I know," she replied. "I could have handled it. I know," he said. "But I'm glad you did." And she nodded, because this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming the right to stand, to be seen, to fight for what was truly theirs. The silent, heavy tension of the confrontation lingered. Even after Silas Vance's retreating figure was swallowed by the dark forest. Ethan and Clara May returned from the county courthouse, a place where justice felt as elusive as rain in a drought. Silas had tried to use the law, relying on Clara May's lack of documentation to claim what he insisted was his. They knew the scales of justice often tilted away from those with nothing but their word. As they reached the ridge overlooking their cabin, a soft curl of smoke from the chimney offered a fleeting sense of ease. It was a familiar sight, a promise of warmth and safety. But the feeling shattered the moment they saw what was hanging on the porch. It was Daisy's favorite doll, stained, torn, nailed to the wall like a crucifix. A grotesque, silent declaration. Clara May gasped, a sound torn from her throat, and leapt from the wagon. She yanked the doll down with trembling hands, clutching it against a chest, her eyes wide, her mouth silent in a scream only she could hear. Inside the cabin, nothing was broken, but nothing was whole either. The cellar door was wide open, a dark maw. The food stores were untouched. On the table, written in chalk, stark and defiant, were two words, "You lose." Luke, Owen, and Daisy, Noah and Grace. They were gone. No notes, no footprints, no sign of struggle. Just an aching, terrifying absence. Ethan fell to his knees, the ground cold and unyielding beneath him. Clara May stood like a statue, her hands still wrapped around the desecrated doll. Then she whispered one raw, ragged word. "Where?" Ethan looked up, his mind racing, forced to think like the predator who had taken them. Where would he take them? He closed his eyes, straining to remember. Then it hit him. South Ridge, past the split in the creek, where Silas's cousin once owned a hunting cabin. Empty now, remote, no law, no prying eyes. "South Ridge," he said, his voice clipped, rising with renewed urgency. Clara May was already moving, untying his horse from the wagon, driven by a desperate, primal instinct. She was in the saddle before Ethan could even mount his own. They rode like fire through the hills, dusk bleeding into night. No words passed between them, just the rhythmic pound of hooves and the frantic beat of their hearts. The cabin appeared at the edge of a hollow, small, dark, quiet, too quiet. Ethan tied the horses far back and crept toward the door, rifle drawn. Clara May held a worn hunting blade in one hand, Daisy's doll clutched in the other. Then a muffled cry from inside. They moved fast, no hesitation. Ethan kicked the door in. What they found wasn't what they feared, but it was close enough to shatter their fragile peace. The children were huddled in one corner, pale, eyes wide with fear. Noah stood defiant in front of them. Silas sat across the room, slumped in a chair, bleary with drink, a pistol on the floor near his boot. "You came," he slurred, a drunken, triumphant smile twisting his lips. Clara May stepped forward, her gaze fixed. Silas raised his glass. "Cheers to the end." She didn't answer. She simply crossed the floor, dropped the desecrated doll at his feet, and picked up the pistol before he could even blink. Then she turned her back to him. "Come on," she told the children, her voice soft but firm. "Time to go." Silas didn't follow. He didn't fight. He just laughed, a broken, hollow sound that echoed in the small cabin as they left him behind. As they stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, Ethan looked back once. Silas was still sitting in the dark, alone, utterly broken by the quiet, unyielding strength of the woman he had tried to possess. By the time they reached home, the sun was rising, a promise of a new day. Grace held Clara May's hand like she'd never let go. Daisy slept in Ethan's arms. Luke cried without sound. Noah walked barefoot but upright, strong, inside the cabin. Clara May collapsed onto the floor, the doll still clutched in her hand, and for the first time since she'd met him, Ethan wept, not because of pain, but because it was over, or at least this part of it. The days that followed passed not like time, but like healing slow, uneven. The cabin, once a simple shelter, had become something more profound. No longer just four walls, but a beginning. A life where no one had to flinch when boots hit the porch, where doors weren't locked out of fear. The morning after they returned, Clara May didn't rise with the dawn. She stayed curled on the floor near the hearth, her hand tangled in Daisy's curls. When Ethan stirred, he didn't wake her. He just pulled a quilt over both of them and started coffee. By mid-morning, Grace was cleaning. Noah chopped wood. Luke insisted on sleeping beside Clara May. Owen didn't let go of her hand. No one asked where Silas had gone. They didn't need to. Sometimes. The worst punishment isn't death. It's knowing you've lost, fully and forever, and being forced to live with the quiet that follows. The next day, Clara May bathed. She dressed in clean clothes, pulling her hair back with Daisy's ribbon. She stepped onto the porch with a face that looked 10 years older and 20 years stronger. "I want to rebuild the chicken coop," she said to Ethan. He didn't blink, just stood, nodded, and fetched his tools. They worked all day. Noah helped dig the foundation. Grace fetched nails and wood. Luke wandered in and out with Scout, who hadn't left Clara May's side since their return. Clara May measured each board twice, hammering each nail with precision. She didn't talk much, but her silence was focused, certain. The coop went up by sunset. When the last beam was set, Ethan handed her the hammer. She drove the final nail herself. That night, they all ate together, celebrating. Noah told a joke. Grace rolled her eyes. Luke fell asleep in his soup. Daisy chased fireflies, her laughter floating like music. And when Clara May looked at Ethan across the table, something in her eyes softened, a warmth that had been hidden for so long, finally emerging. Clara May's eyes softened as she looked at Ethan across the rough-hewn table, a warmth finally emerging, bright and clear. "Will you come with me tomorrow?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Where?" Ethan replied. "Harmony Bluff. I want to file papers for the children. If something happens to me, I want their names protected. I want this place to be theirs." Ethan nodded, understanding the profound need behind her words. Of course. But Clara May didn't stop there. She hesitated, then met his gaze again, her eyes steady, unafraid. "I want to change my name." Ethan's breath caught. "To what?" She looked at him, absolutely resolute. "To Clara Stone." A long silence fell between them. Ethan knelt beside her. "You don't need to take my name," he said, his voice low, gentle. "I know," she replied, "but I want it. Not because I'm yours, but because I'm not his." He didn't touch her, simply sat beside her. And for the first time since that desperate knock on his door, he smiled a deep, genuine smile that promised peace. The next morning, they rode together again, not in desperation, but with quiet, unshakable purpose. At Harmony Bluff. The courthouse clerk raised an eyebrow when Clara May handed her the form. "Stone, huh?" she said. Clara May nodded, chin held high. "That's right." The clerk stamped the paper. "Well, Miss Stone, welcome to Harmony County." It wasn't a wedding, but as Clara May held the signed paper, she did so with a reverence deeper than any ceremony could have given it. It was about becoming something more than what she'd endured, a self she chose, a family she claimed, a future she named. It was the mark of true freedom. When they returned to the cabin, Scout greeted them, tail wagging furiously. Noah dragged a broken chair, eager for a new project. Grace taught Daisy to braid grass. Luke had a splinter, insisting only Clara May could remove it. Owen showed off a lizard. The sun was high, and the porch smelled of pine and fresh-baked bread. For the first time, Clara May stepped into her home not as a guest or fugitive, but as Clara Stone, a woman rooted, belonging. Weeks passed, then months. The rhythm of their lives returned, new and stronger. Clara May taught the children to preserve wild berries. Ethan showed Noah how to build a proper windbreak. Grace read to Daisy by lantern light. Luke learned to whistle loudly. Owen became Scout's best friend. Clara May began to move differently now. She no longer kept a satchel by the door, nor her boots half-laced. She let herself take up space, lingered at the table, read aloud, and meticulously stitched a quilt, a patchwork of warmth that now belonged to them all. She hadn't forgotten the past. She simply allowed herself to live in something bigger than fear. And Ethan, he let her. He fixed things she didn't ask him to, small acts of care that spoke louder than words. He built a tiny shelf above the hearth so Clara May could line it with what she called her pretty useless things, a smooth blue stone, a pine cone, the children's drawing of their cabin. Still, even comfort has sharp corners, a quiet awareness that peace, hard won, could always be challenged. One night, after the children were asleep, Clara May stepped outside and found Ethan at the edge of the trees. "Do you ever wonder how different your life might have been?" she asked. "Every day?" he replied. "And do you regret it?" He thought for a long time. "No," he said, "because it brought me here." She leaned into him, and for the first time, kissed him. It was simple, certain, a quiet declaration. Love, they both knew, wasn't always grand vows. Sometimes it was silence shared at the edge of the dark. Years would pass. Luke would grow tall. Grace would marry and name her first daughter Clara. Noah would take over the land, building more cabins. Owen would become a teacher. Daisy would become something none could yet imagine, bright, brilliant, bold, and Clara May, she would become the woman she'd always been. Underneath the scars, a matriarch, a legend, not because she was saved, but because she rebuilt, because she endured, because she dared to love again. And Ethan, he'd sit beside her every evening on that porch, watching their world grow from the seeds they never meant to plant. They weren't just survivors. They weren't just protectors. They were a family. The story ended not with a grand triumph, but with Ethan and Clara May sitting together on their porch, gazing at the limitless horizon of Willow Creek Valley, a testament to the quiet strength of love and resilience on the wild frontier.